the first question we're going to talk about is your discussion question about how you could sell a research idea about Nigeria to a non-Nigerian reviewer. So a lot of you are doing research on a specific country, and so this is not only applicable to Nigeria, but if you are in Nigeria doing research on Nigeria, what are ways that you can sell a research idea to a reviewer who's non-Nigerian? And so we're going to basically talk about our experience of trying to use this idea of working within a particular context and trying to sell the idea to someone that may not be from that context, and we're using Nigeria as well as other countries. One example where I've used this idea of trying to show that my research, even though focused on Nigeria, was applicable more broadly. So I was looking at a study about Nigeria and fertilizer, particularly fertilizer subsidy. So what I did was to say, okay, well, if we think about fertilizer consumption in Africa, Nigeria is a major player in that industry, and the demand for fertilizer in Nigeria can have a significant effect on the market within the region. And then I tried to place my research within a specific context of the literature, which was the effect of fertilizer subsidies on commercial fertilizer use. So there had been a lot of studies across the continent, in East Africa, Southern Africa, where people had found out that the fertilizer subsidy programs ended up crowding out commercial fertilizer use. And so this was articulated to take place a lot of times within particular contexts. So for example, if you already had well-developed commercial markets, or you had a situation where the nature of the subsidy program completely excluded the fertilizer suppliers within that country. And so I was looking at Nigeria's situation, and this was the fertilizer subsidy program before the GES, where the government of Nigeria was trying to work with the private sector to distribute fertilizer through the subsidy program, and certain states were selected as pilots. And so there was Taraba and Kano. And so within that context, we were actually looking at fertilizer subsidy programs where government was working through the private sector, as well as in a case where many times there was not a very strong link between the fertilizer dealers and the farmers. And so in that case, I was actually able to sell the idea that in Nigeria, we are finding something quite different than what other studies on this same topic in other African countries had found. And it was because of the context within which the fertilizer subsidy program was actually administered. And by doing that, I was able to actually show that the research was very relevant in the case of Nigeria, helping us to learn how the structure of the program could lead to a different outcome that was actually positive, because it actually crowded in, meaning that people who participated in the fertilizer program were also more likely to buy commercial fertilizer from a dealer. And I was also able to articulate that this was different from what other countries had found out, but was also broadly applicable because I focused on the structure of the program and the factors in the design of the program that made it likely that we found the results that we did. And so that paper was now focused on Nigeria, about Nigeria, but broadly applicable on the continent and for fertilizer subsidy programs. And then it was able to be published in the Agricultural Economics, which is the journal of the International Agricultural Economics Association.
Very interesting. I was thinking as you were talking about the two different cases of using Nigeria to sell your paper in the international journal publication. One that you focused on is where you have a new theme. You know, the theme could be fertilizer subsidies if it hasn't been studied before, or that it has been studied before in general, but that you've come to a case of a new policy that's a different policy than other people are using. And in that case, you need simply to point out that Nigeria and the new policy are coincident, and that it's interesting in that sense. Or that if the theme is new, for example, you're testing the effect on rural non-farm employment on soil conservation investment, which is a fairly new theme, then you could say Nigeria is an apt case of that theme because it has areas of erosion, it has areas of flooding and soil leaching, etc. And so you're saying that Nigeria is interesting as an example to show this new idea. Now, there's a separate second whole world of justification where you're taking something that's already been done. Let's say that there's already been done something on decomposing inequality of income in rural areas. This is a theme that's been studied and published on for 20, 30 years. And so when you come to the literature and you say, I am going to now apply Gini decomposition of income in rural areas or something like that to the Nigerian case, the reviewer a priori looks at that and says, so what? Why do I care about the Nigeria case? I have to justify in my review that this is a contribution to the international literature. There's 200 countries. One more does not necessarily make a contribution. So in that case, you have to say, why would the characteristics of Nigeria, make it a useful new case? Now, clearly it's not interesting to say that Nigeria has many small farms and issues of poverty and this sort of thing, because that's many, many countries in Africa and Asia, and that isn't considered to be a differentiating point. But you could say, for example, one thing that really strikes me when it comes to income inequality and using the Nigerian case is simply that there's the Dutch disease issue in Nigeria, that this is an oil-rich country, and so there's sort of a disproportionate flow of funds coming from a particular sector, and that could affect the decomposition, it could affect the inequality of income in rural areas in ways that are not typical in areas that don't have very strong natural resource flows of funds coming in. Another point that could be worthwhile, that may or may not be, is that Nigeria is the largest country, or will soon be the largest economy in Africa, and many people published at least 10 years ago, they published many papers on China, simply, or Mexico or Brazil, simply arguing that now as these have come onto the radar screen of the world, anything one could know about what's happening in them. That only lasts for 1 or 2 years, and then everybody says, we know Nigeria well now, it's not a new topic, and then you can't use that anymore.
Yeah, as you were speaking, brought a couple of other ideas or, examples to my mind. I think you're very right, which is the fact that, there's an issue of whether it's a kind of a new theme or something specific about Nigeria, or something specific about how something that might be an old theme was actually done in Nigeria, right? So it could be an old theme. The policy, fertilizer subsidy, is not a new thing, but the situation in terms of how it was actually applied in Nigeria was actually different. So I really like that idea that it could be a new theme, an old theme, or a new theme within a new characteristic of Nigeria, or a characteristic of how the program in Nigeria was actually implemented. Another thing that I found useful in my research in terms of thinking about how to sell a research that is in a particular context, say Nigeria, but having a broader application, is also in terms of being kind of conscious of what has been the focus of the literature and seeing if there's some new twist you could bring to it. So for example, if you think about climate change and climate change adaptation, there are a lot of studies that talk about how farmers are adapting to climate change, and even within Nigeria, a lot of studies about different parts of Nigeria and different kinds of things that people do. But if you go into literature, I was surprised as we studied the poultry and value chain that there were not so many studies done about climate change adaptation for small animals, thinking about things like goats and sheep or even poultry. There was a few on large animals like cows, but very little on small animals. And so that gives you an opportunity to take a topic that people are talking a lot about, and now it doesn't matter where you are. If you are the first person or one of the first few people to do a topic like climate change adaptation in small animals, then you can publish your paper irrespective of where you're from. And so this is another thing that I've used, and actually we're doing work on the adaptation of poultry farmers to climate change, particularly heat stress in Nigeria.